The Ardennes Forest, December 1944. A brutal, unforgiving winter has descended upon the jagged heights of the Eifel region, turning the dense pines into skeletal sentinels frozen in a landscape of monochromatic white. The air is not merely cold, it is an invasive force, sharp as a bayonet, lungs burning with every labored breath. Beneath the canopy of a makeshift field hospital, the silence is punctuated only by the rhythmic, metallic clatter of distant artillery and the low, guttural moans of men for whom the Reich's promised victory has become a hollow, freezing grave. Inside this sanctum of suffering, German nurses move like specters, their hands cracked and blue-veined from the frost, their breath blooming in thick clouds under the dim, flickering light of oil lamps. The floor of the requisitioned farmhouse is slick with a mixture of melted snow and the dark, frozen slush of human trauma. There is no warmth here. The heating oil ran dry days ago, and the wood-burning stove sits cold, a silent monument to a logistical system that is rapidly hemorrhaging its lifeblood. The nurses, women who had been told that the Ardennes offensive would be the decisive blow to shatter the Western Allies, now find themselves trapped in a reality defined by scarcity. They wrap their feet in torn blankets and strips of burlap, trying to maintain a semblance of professional order amidst a chaos that smells of gangrene and unwashed wool. Every movement is a struggle against the lethargy of hypothermia. The supplies, the basic necessities of mercy, are gone. Bandages are being washed and reused until they are stiff with the ghosts of previous wounds. Morphine is a memory. When a soldier screams, the nurses can offer nothing but a damp rag and a whispered prayer that the end comes swiftly. This is the end stadium, the final stage of a war effort that has consumed everything. The ideological fervor of the early years has been replaced by a singular, primal focus: survival. Outside, the sky is a leaden ceiling, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the German staff waits in the deepening shadows, listening to the encroaching thunder of the American counter-offensive. They had been warned about the Americans, described by propaganda as a soft, pampered race of businessmen who would crumble when faced with the iron will of the German soldier. They expected the victors to be vengeful, perhaps as desperate and starving as themselves. They expected the cruelty that usually follows the collapse of a front. Yet, as the sound of heavy tread and the distinct mechanical whine of GMC trucks draws closer, the fear in the room becomes a physical presence, thicker than the cold. The nurses stand by the pallets of the dying, shielding their patients with their own trembling bodies, watching the door as the first silhouette of an American soldier breaks through the frost-crusted frame. The contrast is immediate and jarring. These men do not look like the exhausted, skeletal remains of the Wehrmacht. They are wrapped in heavy wool, their faces ruddy with health, their eyes alert behind the steel rims of their helmets. They carry with them the unmistakable aura of a nation that has not yet learned the meaning of nothing. In this frozen farmhouse, the collision of two worlds is about to be mediated not by a weapon, but by the steam rising from a heavy, galvanized bucket. To understand the shock of the German nurses, one must first grasp the depth of the deprivation that had become the standard of the Third Reich's twilight. By the winter of 1944, the German logistical machine, once the envy of the world for its precision during the Blitzkrieg years, had been ground into the dirt by the relentless attrition of a two-front war. The logic of scarcity was the only logic left. In Berlin, the Ministry of Armaments squeezed every last drop of blood from the civilian population to feed the front, yet it was never enough. For the medical staff in the Ardennes, this meant a daily existence defined by the absence of the essential. They were operating in a vacuum of resources where the state's primary concern was no longer the recovery of the individual, but the mere delay of the inevitable. Rations for the medical units had dwindled to ersatz, coffee made from roasted acorns and a thin, grayish bread stretched with sawdust. Meat was a luxury seen only in propaganda films. On the front line, it was a ghost. The German nurses had been conditioned by years of total war to accept that a soldier's meal was a tool of survival, not a source of comfort. They lived in an ideological framework that praised hardness as the supreme virtue. To suffer without complaint was considered a service to the Führer. Consequently, they viewed the American soldiers through the lens of their own state-sponsored myths. They were told the Americans were a soft, commercialized people who required endless luxuries to maintain their morale, and that without their decadent supplies, they would shatter like glass against the iron resolve of the Germanic spirit. Historical data from the period paints a grim picture of the German collapse. While the United States was producing over 200,000 tons of medical supplies and millions of tons of food for its troops, the German transport system relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons, which were systematically slaughtered for food when the supply lines failed. The nurses saw this regression every day. They watched as their noble cavalry horses were butchered in the snow, their carcasses picked clean within hours. This environment created a psychological armor. The nurses expected the world to be cold, hungry, and cruel because that was the only world that remained for them. They could not conceive of a military force that viewed a hot, nutritious meal as a standard logistical requirement rather than a miracle. This disconnect between their indoctrinated expectations and the impending reality would soon create a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. In their minds, the approaching Americans were either going to be starving monsters who would steal their remaining scraps, or weaklings who would perish in the Ardennes winter. They were utterly unprepared for the sight of men who possessed both the strength of a conqueror and the surplus of a merchant. As the sounds of the American advance grew from a low rumble to a deafening roar, the nurses looked at their empty pots and their dying men, bracing for the impact of a force they believed they understood, but which was about to dismantle every truth they had ever been told. The air in the field hospital grew thin with anticipation, the silence between the falling shells occupied only by the ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down the seconds until the old world finally broke. The collapse of the line came not as a single explosion, but as a cascading failure of sound and light. By the late afternoon, the rhythmic thud of German 88s had been drowned out by the terrifying rapid-fire symphony of American artillery, a barrage so relentless that the earth itself seemed to liquefy beneath the snow. Inside the farmhouse, the ceiling joists groaned, shedding flakes of dried plaster onto the wounded. The German nurses watched through the frosted panes as the retreating remnants of their own army scrambled past, ghosts in tattered gray coats, their horse-drawn supply carts abandoned and burning in the ditches. The Wacht am Rhein had ended. The counter-offensive that was supposed to drive the Allies back to the sea had evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum of power that the Americans were eager to fill. Suddenly, the violence shifted. The roar of the engines changed pitch, and the sharp, staccato bark of M1 Garand replaced the distant thunder. The nurses huddled in the center of the infirmary, their arms linked, forming a fragile human wall between the door and the men who could no longer move. When the front door was finally kicked open, it was not the expected storm of grenades or the spray of a submachine gun that greeted them. Instead, a wall of cold air rushed in, followed by the heavy, measured boots of U.S. infantrymen. The Germans froze, waiting for the execution they had been told was inevitable for those who served the Reich. They saw the olive-drab uniforms, the strange, rounded helmets, and the bayonets that caught the dying light of the oil lamps. The initial terror was paralyzing. The nurses had been fed a steady diet of stories detailing the American gangsters, who took no prisoners and delighted in the destruction of German culture. They squeezed their eyes shut, expecting the worst. However, the anticipated massacre never materialized. Instead, the American soldiers moved with a brisk, almost clinical efficiency. They secured the perimeter with a series of curt shouts, but their primary focus quickly shifted to the state of the room. The nurses opened their eyes to find themselves being observed not with hatred, but with a mixture of pity and professional curiosity. The Americans didn't see enemies, they saw a catastrophe. This was the moment the ideological facade began to crack. The German staff watched as the GIs signaled for their own medical teams. Within minutes, The farmhouse was swarmed by American combat medics who began assessing the German wounded with the same intensity they applied to their own. The sheer speed of the transition from combat to care was staggering. There was no looting, no taunting, and no ideological lectures. There was only the sound of heavy crates being dragged across the floor and the snapping of sterile seals. The nurses stood in stunned silence as their captors transformed the desperate charnel house into a functioning medical station. The realization that they were no longer in control was secondary to a much more profound observation. The Americans were not fighting for survival, they were managing a victory. The terror of the collapse began to give way to a haunting, quiet bewilderment that would soon be shattered by a single, aromatic scent drifting from the back of an American truck. The arrival of the American Medical Detachment was a spectacle of industrial might rendered in flesh and canvas. For the German nurses, who had grown accustomed to the sight of their own doctors wearing blood-stained aprons over threadbare uniforms, the first encounter with the U.S. Army Medical Corps was a moment of profound sensory overload. These men did not arrive with the frantic desperation of a retreating army. They arrived with the calm, methodical rhythm of a civilization that had conquered the problem of supply. The nurses watched from the corners of the room, their eyes wide as they took in the details of the American equipment. The sturdy, waterproof litters, the abundance of clean, white gauze that seemed to flow from their kits like water, and the stainless steel instruments that gleamed under the oil lamps. The contrast in physical condition was perhaps the most jarring element. The German staff were skeletal, their skin a translucent parchment stretched over bone, their eyes sunken from months of chronic malnutrition and the relentless stress of the Kessel battles. In contrast, the American medics appeared almost unnaturally healthy. Their skin was ruddy, their frames filled out by a diet of high-calorie rations, and their hands, the most vital tool of their trade, were steady and strong. There was a quiet confidence in their movements that the Germans found incomprehensible. To the nurses, every bandage used was a loss to the collective inventory. To the Americans, a bandage was a disposable utility, discarded without a second thought once it had served its purpose. This was the American way of war, a war of attrition won not just through the courage of the infantry, but through the overwhelming superiority of the medical and logistical tale. The German nurses witnessed the unpacking of crates that contained more sulfa powder and penicillin than their entire district had seen in a year. They saw the Americans deploy portable heating units, small but powerful devices that began to drive the damp, bone-chilling frost from the farmhouse walls. For the first time in weeks, the air inside the hospital began to lose its scent of decay, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic and the hum of organized activity. The nurses' initial fear began to mutate into a strange, hollow sort of awe. They had been told that the Americans were a people of cultur nihilismus, a nation with no soul, yet they were witnessing a level of care for the wounded that bordered on the sacred. They watched as a young American medic knelt in the filth of the floor to stabilize the shattered leg of a German teenager, speaking in a low, soothing tone that bypassed the language barrier through the sheer force of human empathy. The German women realized then that the propaganda had failed them entirely. They were not being occupied by a horde of barbarians. They were being relieved by a force that possessed the one thing the Reich had traded away for ideological purity, the capacity for mercy backed by the means to enact it. As the Americans worked, the nurses remained motionless, their worldview tilting on its axis, waiting for the next revelation in this strange, well-fed new world. Then it happened, a sensory shift that would remain etched in the memories of those women longer than the sound of the guns. Through the heavy oak doors of the farmhouse, a group of American support troops entered, carrying large, insulated olive-drab canisters. As the lids were unlatched, a thick, billowing cloud of steam erupted into the frigid air of the ward. With it came a scent so alien, so potently rich, that the German nurses visibly recoiled in a collective gasp of disbelief. It was the smell of beef stock, slow-simmered onions, and garden vegetables, the unmistakable, heartbreaking aroma of warm, hearty soup. To a population that had been subsisting on watery cabbage and sawdust bread, the smell was not merely food, it was a physical assault of abundance. The nurses watched, frozen, as the American medics began to ladle the thick liquid into tin cups. They saw real chunks of meat sliding into the vessels, accompanied by the vibrant orange of carrots and the hearty weight of potatoes. In the German military hierarchy, such a meal would have been reserved for the highest echelons of the officer corps, and even then, only on special occasions. Here, in the middle of a frozen wasteland, under the shadow of a crumbling front, the Americans were serving it to common soldiers, and even to the prisoners. The steam rose in swirling columns, catching the golden light of the lamps, turning the grim farmhouse into a cathedral of unlikely nourishment. The symbolic weight of the soup was staggering. It represented a logistical chain that spanned an ocean, a system of democracy that prioritized the caloric intake of its frontline troops as a matter of standard procedure. While the German High Command issued frantic orders for total sacrifice, the American Quartermaster Corps was busy ensuring that a private from Ohio had access to hot vitamins. One of the nurses, her hands trembling so violently she had to tuck them into her apron, watched as a ladle hit the bottom of the canister with a dull, heavy thud, signaling a depth of supply that felt infinite. The gasp that had escaped the nurses was the sound of 1,000 propaganda posters tearing in half. They had been told the Americans were starving in their foxholes, that the U-boats had severed their lifelines, and that the plutocratic West was too fragile to endure the hardships of a European winter. Yet, the steam rising from those canisters told a different story. It spoke of a nation whose industrial heart was beating with a terrifying, healthy rhythm. As the first cup was handed to a wounded German corporal, who clutched it with the desperation of a drowning man, the nurses realized that they were not just witnessing a meal. They were witnessing the primary weapon of the American arsenal, the ability to provide warmth in a world they had turned cold. The soup was the ultimate counter-argument to every speech they had ever heard, a liquid manifestation of a freedom that could afford to be generous even in the depths of winter. The miracle of the warm soup was not an accident of fate. It was the deliberate result of a logistical masterpiece known as the American industrial machine. While the German army had been reduced to foraging and the desperate slaughter of its transport horses, the United States had transformed the supply of the front line into an exact science. At the heart of this achievement was the Red Ball Express, an enormous convoy system that moved thousands of tons of supplies daily from the ports of Normandy to the advancing edges of the front. This relentless artery of democracy ensured that even as the Ardennes winter sought to freeze the gears of war, the American soldier remained the best-equipped and best-fed combatant in human history. The factual data of this era reveals a staggering disparity in national capability. By late 1944, the American economy was outproducing the entire Axis combined by a factor of nearly 3-to-1. This was a war of statistics as much as steel. For every calorie a German soldier managed to scavenge from the frozen earth, his American counterpart was guaranteed a minimum of 4,000 calories a day, often delivered in the form of hot, fresh meals. The galvanized canisters of soup that had so shocked the nurses were the final links in a chain that began in the lush farmlands of the American Midwest, passed through the massive factories of Detroit and Chicago, and crossed the Atlantic in Liberty ships that were being built faster than the U-boats could sink them. The German nurses, standing amidst the steam of the American ladles, were witnessing the failure of their own national ideology. They had been taught that the German spirit was superior to materialism, yet they were seeing that a spirit without material support is a candle in a hurricane. The Americans didn't just bring weapons, they brought an entire civilization. Their trucks moved on rubber tires while the Germans moved on wooden wheels and iron rims. Their medics used disposable, single-use items while the Germans boiled old bandages. This logistical mastery was the ultimate expression of a society that valued the individual. In the American view, a soldier who was warm and fed was a soldier who could fight harder, live longer, and return home to the democracy he was defending. The sheer volume of the American surplus was incomprehensible to the German staff. They watched as the American medics cracked open crates of K-rations and C-rations, which contained not only meat and crackers but also chocolate, cigarettes, and coffee, items that had vanished from German life years ago. To the nurses, these were not merely supplies. They were symbols of a power that was fundamentally untouchable. The American industrial engine had reached into the most remote, frozen corners of Europe to provide a bowl of soup, proving that the distance between Omaha and the Ardennes was shorter than the distance between the Nazi leadership and reality. As the nurses helped distribute the soup, they weren't just feeding the hungry. They were participating in the quiet, methodical dismantling of the Third Reich's economic and logistical myths. As the afternoon light faded into a bruised purple over the Ardennes, the internal architecture of the German nurses' world began to collapse. They watched, transfixed, as the American medical team moved through the ward, performing a quiet revolution of empathy. The nurses had been indoctrinated to believe that the Geneva Convention was a mere suggestion, a set of rules that lesser races would ignore when convenient. They expected to be pushed aside, their patients neglected or worse. Instead, they were invited into a collaborative effort that defied the very nature of the conflict raging outside. A young American medic, his sleeves rolled up despite the chill, gestured for a nurse to assist him with a plasma transfusion. It was a simple movement, a professional acknowledgement, but to the woman, it was a shattering blow to the concept of the Untermensch. The change in perception was visceral. The nurses observed the Americans treating German soldiers, men who had been trying to kill them only hours before, with the same meticulous care they afforded their own wounded. There was no distinction made between the olive drab jacket and the field gray tunic. To the Americans, there were only bodies in need of stabilization. The German women saw their own countrymen, who had been lying in their own filth and despair, suddenly washed, bandaged, and fed. They saw the American medics use sulfonamide and morphine with a liberal hand, treating pain not as a weakness to be endured, but as a medical condition to be solved. This display of humanity was more disarming than any artillery barrage. It forced the nurses to confront the reality that they had been lied to, not just about the war's progress, but about the very character of their enemies. This transition was fueled by the recurring presence of the soup. As the nurses moved between the pallets, handing out the warm cups, they saw the tension drain from the faces of the wounded. The soup was a bridge. It was the first time in years that many of these men and women had felt a sense of security that wasn't tied to a military victory. The warmth of the liquid seemed to thaw the ideological ice that had gripped their hearts. They began to see the Americans not as conquerors, but as providers. The nurses found themselves mirroring the American behavior, their movements becoming more fluid, their voices losing the sharp edge of panic. They were no longer cogs in a failing machine of war. They were being pulled back into the fold of a common humanity by the simple act of shared labor and shared nourishment. The transformation was silent but absolute. As the night deepened, the farmhouse became an island of strange peace amidst the surrounding storm. The nurses looked at the American medics, men who were tired, dirty, and far from home, yet who possessed a surplus of kindness that mirrored their surplus of supplies. The realization took hold that the Reich had lost the war because it had forgotten how to value the individual, whereas the Americans brought their entire society's wealth to bear just to save a single life. The German staff worked through the night, but they were no longer working for the Führer or for the glory of a 1,000-year empire. They were working for the men in the beds, guided by the steady, well-fed hands of their captors, realizing that the warmth in the room was not just coming from the soup, but from the sudden, terrifying absence of hate. As the night pressed against the windows, the nurses found themselves grappling with a heavy, contemplative silence. Each time they dipped a ladle into the American canisters, the weight of the metal tool felt like a physical measurement of their own nation's failure. They had spent years in a culture that glorified the will to power, a philosophy that suggested that the spirit could overcome any material deficit. Yet, as they watched the steam curl around the exhausted faces of the wounded, they realized that will was a poor substitute for a functioning supply line. The weight of the ladle was the weight of a truth they had tried to ignore, that the war was not being lost on some abstract spiritual battlefield, but right here, in the ability to provide warmth and sustenance to the suffering. The emotional reflection of the staff deepened as they observed the American surplus in action. To the Germans, every resource was a zero-sum game. If one person ate, another went hungry. But the Americans seemed to operate on a different plane of existence. When a cup of soup was spilled, a medic simply reached for another, cleaned the floor with a fresh rag, and continued his work without the panic of a man who has lost something irreplaceable. This casual relationship with abundance was a revelation. It suggested a society so vast and so productive that it could afford to be clumsy, could afford to be generous, and could afford to treat the enemy as a human being in need of a meal. The nurses began to understand that the American industrial machine was not just a collection of factories, but a manifestation of an ideology that viewed the individual life as an asset worth preserving at any cost. For the head nurse, the sight of a young American soldier sharing his own chocolate bar with a German orphan who had been hiding in the cellar was the final straw. She realized that the decadence she had been taught to despise was actually a form of resilience. The Americans were not soft, they were simply supported. Their strength came not from the desperation of the cornered wolf, but from the steady, quiet confidence of the well-fed lion. The reflection in the eyes of the German staff was no longer one of defiance, but of a profound, mourning realization. They were mourning the years they had spent believing in a lie, and they were mourning the millions of lives lost to a system that valued the state over the soul. The soup had become more than nourishment. It was a lens through which they saw the inevitable future. They saw a world where the primary weapon of democracy was not the bomb, but the bowl. The larger truth began to take shape in the dim light of the ward. Freedom was not a luxury of the rich, but the source of the richness itself. By allowing the individual to thrive, the Americans had created a collective power that could reach across a frozen continent to deliver a simple, hot meal. This was the ideology that would win the peace, just as it was winning the war. As the nurses worked, their movements became more intentional, as if they were trying to absorb some of that American confidence through the very handles of the ladles they held. The shattering of German ideology occurred in the quiet moments between the clatter of tin cups and the steady hum of American efficiency. For years, the National Socialist state had functioned on the premise of racial and cultural supremacy, a narrative that relied on the depiction of the Western Allies as a fractured, materialistic, and ultimately cowardly collection of mongrel peoples. The nurses had been told that American strength was a facade of Hollywood glamour, easily punctured by the iron resolve of the German soldier. They were taught that American generosity was a trick of the weak and that their abundance was a sign of a decadent society that would wither under the purifying fire of total war. Yet, as the night wore on, every action of the American medics acted as a physical refutation of these lies. The ideological foundation upon which these women had built their lives did not crack under the pressure of a speech or a pamphlet, but under the weight of a warm, wooden spoon. The contrast between the promised Reich and the arrived reality was total. The nurses looked at the American soldiers, men who came from a land that had never been bombed, whose factories were running around the clock, and whose families were safe, and they saw a strength that was not born of desperation or hate. It was a strength born of a surplus of life. They saw that the Americans did not need to be hard in the way the German state demanded, because they were supported by a system that valued the preservation of its people. The realization that the German people had been sacrificed for a regime that couldn't even provide them with soup, while the decadent Americans had enough to feed their enemies, was a psychological blow that many of the staff could barely process. They watched as the Americans used their massive resources not just to kill, but to rebuild the very people they had defeated. This was the moment the nurses confronted the most painful truth of all. They were not being rescued from a monster, but from a delusion. The propaganda had created a monster out of the American GI to justify the suffering of the German civilian. In the presence of actual Americans, that monster evaporated, replaced by young men who were more concerned with the temperature of a patient's broth than the purity of their bloodline. The German nurses felt a profound sense of betrayal, not toward the Americans, but toward the leaders who had sent their brothers and fathers to die in the snow for a lie. They realized that the weakness of democracy was actually its greatest weapon, the ability to be humane because it possessed the abundance to afford it. As the night shifted toward the pale gray of a winter dawn, the nurses moved with a new, somber clarity. They no longer looked for the arrival of German reinforcements. They no longer believed in the Wunderwaffen or the final victory. The only wonder they had seen was the steam from a soup canister, and the only victory that mattered was the one being won over the frostbite and the hunger in that small farmhouse. The ideological shield had been stripped away, leaving them vulnerable but finally, for the first time in over a decade, capable of seeing the world as it truly was. They were no longer subjects of a 1,000-year empire. They were human beings standing in the presence of a civilization that had proven its superiority through the simple, overwhelming power of a hot meal. The sun rose over the Ardennes on a world that had been irrevocably altered, the light catching the jagged edges of the pines and the soft, drifting plumes of smoke from the farmhouse chimney. Inside, the ward was quiet, the frantic energy of the night having settled into a rhythmic, peaceful exhaustion. The German nurses stood by the window, watching as the American logistical tail continued to unfurl across the snowy valley, a seemingly endless line of trucks, jeeps, and ambulances stretching toward the horizon. They realized then that the soup was not a singular miracle, but a standard feature of a life they had been denied. It was the warmth of a freedom that did not need to hoard its resources because its capacity to create them was limitless. The epilogue of this encounter is not found in military maps or casualty lists, but in the enduring truth of human dignity. The soup served as a liquid manifestation of a democratic ideal, that the strength of a nation is measured not by the territory it conquers, but by the hunger it satisfies. The nurses had witnessed the ultimate defeat of the Third Reich, and it hadn't come through the fire of a flamethrower or the weight of a heavy tank. It had come through a galvanized canister and a metal ladle. They understood now that a society that prioritizes the welfare of the individual, even an enemy individual, possesses a moral and material resilience that no autocracy can ever hope to match. As the Americans prepared to move the wounded further behind the lines, the nurses assisted with a sense of purpose that transcended their prisoner status. They were no longer captives of a foreign army. They were witnesses to a larger truth. The ideological fever of the past 12 years had finally broken, replaced by the simple, enduring reality of a warm meal shared in the dark. They had seen the face of their enemy, and they had found it was the face of a provider. The soup was the bridge that brought them back from the precipice of nihilism, proving that even in the deepest winter of human history, the warmth of abundance and the light of mercy can still find a way through the frost. In the final accounting of the war, the story of the Ardennes soup remains a poetic reflection on the nature of liberty. It reminds us that the greatest weapon of democracy is its generosity, and its most profound victory is the restoration of the soul. The German nurses, walking out into the crisp morning air, carried with them more than just the memory of a meal. They carried the seeds of a new Europe, one built on the realization that the true measure of power is the ability to offer a bowl of soup to a stranger in the snow. The war would continue for months, but in that small farmhouse, the peace had already begun, fueled by the steam of a 1,000-mile supply line and the quiet, steady heartbeat of a free people.